Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first of our new season of lectures. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Bridget Bennett, tonight's speaker. Bridget is a professor of American literature and culture at Leeds University, and she's going to talk to us tonight about the anti-slavery movement and its many forms on both sides of the Atlantic. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Bridget.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to put this timer on. I'm a talker and you don't want to be here forever. Or maybe you do. I suspect you don't. It's also quite hot in here, so I don't think it does want to be in here forever. Okay. So thank you very much for those of you who are here on Zoom, for those of you who are here in person, and especially for the Thoresby Society for inviting me and the Leeds Library for hosting. This library has a special place in the evolution of the book that I'll be talking about tonight, not the least because the Quaker, the Leeds-based Quaker merchant, activist, abolitionist and writer Wilson Armistead, a bit of a hero in this story, was a member of this library, and many of his books are here. Now, it's traditional for people to say, I never meant to write this book. And it's traditional for audiences to go, yeah, right. But actually, it's really true, not least because I'm a literary scholar and this is a history series. So I really didn't intend to write this book. And I am slightly concerned about what historians will say about it. But it's done now, so we'll have to deal with that when it happens. But to think about why I ended up writing a book rather than the book I was supposed to be writing, I want to turn back to 2007, so a long time ago, to the events commemorating the bicentenary of the parliamentary abolition of the slave trade. Now, together with an undergraduate student, I developed a series of events at the university, including, and this was the one that kind of allowed a lot of other things to happen, an exhibition at the Stanley and Audrey Burton Gallery. Which conceptually brought together the law of 1807, which had banned, as you know, the slave trade within the British Empire, with the development of the new phase of abolitionist campaigning that took place after the Slavery Act of 1833 that finally made slavery illegal in the British Empire. So as you've heard, I'm an Americanist, so the other stuff wasn't really my thing. But thinking about how abolition then started to focus on the slaveholding states of the South was something I could think about more. So I particularly wanted to think about something else too, which was why it was when I said I lived in Leeds, everyone would go, great parties, great nightlife, great clubs. And I'd say, great history. And they'd say, no, that's York. Okay. I can do something here with this, at least in talking to people. And I was particularly inspired by a wonderful book by Richard Blackett, who's actually the editor of this series, published many years ago, called Building an Anti-Slavery Wall. And he was the first person really to talk about the visits to Leeds of Black, formerly enslaved individuals as abolitionist lecturers, and to talk about them in that, in a way that drew attention to them rather than to the work of white abolitionists. And I was very inspired by that. And in addition, I really wanted to think about the kind of ways in which people within Leeds were very engaged by slavery and anti-slavery, albeit in a variety of ways. So thinking I want to put on a visual exhibition, I turned to the wonderful leodis.org that some of you will know very, very well to see whether there were examples. What I was specifically looking for were actually playbills, to have a look at the kind of play performances that were put on that I could talk about, because I knew, obviously, as we all did, that Uncle Tom's Cabin, the famous, infamous key abolitionist text that was serialized, it's a novel serialized in 1851 and published in 1852, turned Harriet Beecher Stowe into a celebrity. There were many, many adaptations about it. There's a wonderful book, if you want to read it, by Sarah Menear called Uncle Tom Mania, in which he talks about the card games and all sorts of things that were produced and play adaptations. So I had a look on leodis.org. Now we will see if this works. And it does. To see whether, as I suspected, this was also true of Leeds, and theatre goers would be able to see posters like this, playbills like this around the city. And they could, you can see at the bottom, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Eva's Home, The Slave Hunt. I don't want to suggest that that Uncle Tom's Cabin represented figures of colour in a way that wasn't paternalistic and actually demeaning in places, even though in many ways it was a very radical text. It's a very mixed text. But we also know that when Harriet Beecher Stowe became an international celebrity, she made a tour of this country and she visited Leeds in 1853. She stayed at the house of Edward Baines, who was the editor of the Leeds Mercury, the radical paper, and she was introduced by Wilson Armistead because she attended a reception hosted by the newly formed Leeds Anti-Slavery Association. He was its president, his wife Mary was its librarian. Now this was an unusual association because it included women and men as equal members, although in practice it was of course male dominated. But one of the founders was a woman from Philadelphia, Sarah Pugh, who had been a member of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society and was now active in Leeds. And one of the claims of this book is that, especially through Quakers, the relationship between Leeds and Pennsylvania, between Leeds and Philadelphia, was particularly strong. And it means a whole array of things that I don't think we've talked about enough in the past. Pugh had participated in the very famous anti-slavery convention of American women in 1838, when a pro-slavery mob set fire to Pennsylvania Hall and black and white women exited together, arm in arm, in peaceful solidarity. I feel like there's a PowerPoint coming on, but I'm not quite sure. No, there isn't. That's wrong. Sorry. Anyway, now there are other stories that I was kind of really intrigued by as I was doing this work, and more I began to realize the book I thought I was going to write wasn't really a book, and I was beginning to be more interested in this. And at the exhibition, a wonderful historian, Malcolm Chase, came up to me and said, I want to show you something. And what he wanted to show me, he emailed me later, was this, which is, so this is as you see, it's a census entry from 1851, from the local Leeds census. And what you can see here, or you may not be able to see it clearly, but in one house where Wilson Armistead and his wife Mary are staying, their children, his mother-in-law, there are two figures, William Craft, Ellen Craft, visitors from the United States. He's a cabinet maker, she's wife of William Craft, and they're registered here as, each of them as a fugitive slave. So this is an occasion that is unique, absolutely unique in the census of that year. It anticipates the kind of census activism that suffragettes or suffrage women would participate in the early 20th century. And I was really fascinated in a kind of really particular way, not just about how this was an international event, which it was, but also about how they actually did it. I just couldn't work out how you do this. So I read a lot about census enumerators, and I discovered a lot about local history and the nastiness of Leeds local history at this period. And someone sitting here, Anthony Ram, I don't think he remembers this, but was actually very helpful in telling me about this, and actually is also very knowledgeable about other things I'm going to talk about today. So I became really I really recognized how important libraries like this, libraries like your library, and other libraries are to doing this work. And the knowledge, I just want to kind of shout out, the knowledge of archivists and librarians is extraordinary, and we need to recognize that and celebrate that more. So that was really interesting to me. On the left, there's a picture there of Ellen Craft wearing her celebrated disguise. Importantly to me in the story I told, because this book is partly about sewing, something I don't really do, by the way, but I like to talk about it. She sewed her own trousers. She kept her right arm in a sling because she was unable to read or write as an enslaved woman. She disguised herself as a man. She wore thick glasses so that no one would ask her to read things, saying her eyes were too weak. And together with her husband, as they wrote in their book, they ran 1,000 miles for freedom. They escaped from slavery in Georgia. Now, this story they would tell in their book of 1860, but by the period in which they were staying in Leeds, they were traveling around the country speaking. Well, she wasn't, because women then couldn't speak in public on the stage. So she would sit there silently while her husband spoke. And I found myself really thinking about silences, about who we can't find in the archive, and about who's not there, and about how print newspaper print will just hide what happens to women because they're often not speaking in the public domain. So you hear people speaking about them, but you won't hear their voices. And I began to be really interested too in the census and what's revealed by it and what isn't. So this is the 1850 census. As you see, it's a US census, the free inhabitants of Bibb County, Georgia, which is where their enslaver Robert Collins lives. And you might be able to see his name down there at the bottom with other members of his household, and I should say other white members of his household, because an innovation of that year was the slave schedule. And there you might see Robert Collins right down there at the bottom. And all these figures with no names at all are the people that he held in slavery. And what you see there is their age approximated. And you also see there's a column where there's a place where you can put in whether they're white, black, or mulatto. These are the terms that he used for them. So it's a listing of who you hold in slavery. And right down here, there are these two little bits in that column, and that's the column for fugitives, for people who've escaped. I don't know whether that is the Crafts, because the ages are wrong, but ages are often wrong in slave schedules. And I certainly find them in 1850 in Boston, which is where they were able to escape to on the Underground Railroad, and in fact, where they met Wilson Armistead in the first place. So this fascinating story becomes part of my book. And what I was interested in then was the relationship between noise and silence, between what's on the page and what isn't on the page, people who are in the archive, people who aren't, and how you can tell their stories. And all of this made me think one thing: I just want something more to happen in the city. And that was this blue plaque, which was, I've given you because they're leftovers, the Civic Trust description of this. This was unveiled last year, and I'm really proud that this is now on a hall of residence, which used to be, as Anthony may be talking about later in this series.
Yes, yeah.
Possibly, with the house that William Armistead lived in, from which he and his wife collected materials to send across to the freedmen, as they were called, though some of them were women, in the United States in the period of the Civil War. But previously, you'll notice it's called Virginia Cottage. It was built for the Boyne family, tobacconists in Leeds, whose money came from tobacco, that's to say, unfree labour. So it's really extraordinary story of a house that's built for people whose wealth is built on slavery and then lived in by people who opposed slavery. And it's something of a story, I think, of Leeds too. So all of this stuff you can see, I'm getting drawn in. And I was reading a lot of writing in newspapers and books. But actually, I was I've always been more interested in what people say to each other and how people meet each other and chat and all of that stuff. And then I encountered something which was just up my street. So trying to read what I could of what had been written, I searched a Quaker journal called the British Friend, a 19th century journal. And I encountered a serialized travelogue, which, to be honest, was very interesting. And it's called, and this, you can tell it's not very interesting. Sorry, Wilson Armistead, but it's not. Reminiscences of a Visit to the United States in the Summer of 1850. I mean, it's not a great title, is it? Mind you, nor is one that has, 3 pieces of punctuation and 2 sets of dates. But that's an academic book, you're allowed to do that. Anyway, this was published as 20 unevenly distributed pieces from November 1850 to December 1852. When it ends with this unfulfilled promise to be continued. And to be honest, I was quite pleased that it wasn't. Anyway, sorry, Wilson, but it's true. So it outlines a visit that he made to the United States to carry out business, to visit family members, and to meet abolitionists. And I know that he went there with letters of introduction to various figures, including William Lloyd Garrison, who wasn't there when he went. And because he wasn't there, it meant he met a number of black activists that he might not otherwise have met. And as a Leeds man in 1850, while there were, we know, figures of colour living in this country in some numbers, he wouldn't have met that many black people. But he did when he went to Boston, including the Crofts, and this changed everything. It was completely transformative. So it turned this kind of abstract idea of ethical duty into something that became a political reality that his friends and acquaintances were suffering from. It just changed it, I think. in a period in which the 1850 fugitive slave law, which meant that even if you had escaped from the South as a fugitive to the free states of the North, you were no longer safe. You could be taken back into bondage. The Crafts were being searched for, a number of others were being searched for. So what did they have to do? They had to go across the Atlantic, and that is why they came to England. So it was a really febrile time. Now, the series finishes in transit with Wilson Armistead bobbing along down the Hudson River on a steamboat. And in my imagination, he was there for a long, long time. But I did find out years later he had eventually visited Philadelphia. He talks about seeing a statue of Benjamin Franklin that had fallen off its pedestal. But for a long time in my imagination, he was stuck on the Hudson, and then he was back in Leeds. But there was one thing that I found really extraordinary. So he talks about being in Boston and visiting these very inspiring Black figures. He talks about going up the road to Lynn. It's not far on the train. Even in the 19th century, it was not a long journey. It was a journey that was traversed by a number of abolitionists, but also by fugitives. He talks about attending Quaker meeting there, being given some moss to take back to Leeds for his garden. He was a keen collector, as many Quakers were. But he also talks about meeting a man on a train. It was a brief encounter, an extraordinary one. And he says this: in the carriage in which I was seated were 3 coloured people, one of whom I found to be a fugitive from the horrors of slavery, which he had endured in North Carolina for 43 years. He furnished me with a few particulars of his history and also the providential escape of his family, a wife and 3 children, whom he succeeded in aiding away previously. Having preserved this account, I purpose transcribing it briefly in time for your next number. Now, when I read this, I was amazed, and I thought I found an entirely new slave narrative, which also was very thrilling. I hadn't, but what it is the only British edition of this narrative, and he cuts quite a lot out of it, and that has given me something that I'm working on now to think about. But this is what he found. So it's this 1850 narrative. Slave narratives were a very particular genre that were often published, often to raise money for family or to advertise facts of slavery. And they often had a white amanuensis, because many enslaved people couldn't, because they weren't allowed to learn to read and write. And they would tell quite a generic story. This is an interesting one because this, which I presume is the edition he was handed, probably sold, he doesn't say that, but probably sold, was published in 1850 by Daniel Lang, who for a very short period worked as a Black publisher in Worcester, Massachusetts, before he entered, together with Martin Delaney and, I'm trying to remember the next, Isaac Snowden, the Harvard Medical School, to train to be doctors there. But within a very short period of time, a number of their classmates decided they didn't want to be educated alongside Blacks and had them expelled. So Lang did end up becoming a doctor. He moved to Paris, he became a doctor and ended up living in Liberia. And they all ended up at one point or another living in Liberia. So Jones would go on to become an anti-slavery activist of some importance. And I know he was planning on coming to England, and I've searched a lot of Baptist records, because he was a Baptist, to see whether he did, and a lot of Ship's Manifest to see if he did. But honestly, try finding a man called Thomas Jones in Baptist records. There's lots of them. So when I have a few years, I will do more of this. And at the moment, it kind of doesn't matter to my story, but I really do want to know. And actually, there's a primary school in London that is named, they say, after him. So they think he came there. But right now, there are a lot of Thomas Jones who are Baptists living in London. But what you'll see, I hope, is that the stories that really were interesting to me were kind of odd stories about encounters that often resulted in publications. So it's that relationship between the written and not always the printed that were really interesting to me. And I began to really think I definitely had something book-shaped that I really wanted to write. And I started to imagine what it might be. And at that point, I was lucky enough to, well, I applied for and was lucky enough to be given a Leverhulme Major Fellowship. So this gave me 2 years to do all the transatlantic travel I needed to do. I knew where I wanted to go to all the libraries I needed to go to all all the archives I needed to go to, and it started in September 2020. No libraries, no travel, nothing. And really, I mean that. So then what do you do? Well, I had to reimagine the book completely. And I'm going to hand something round now to show you one of the things. Please look after it carefully. I actually wiped it today, which is very rare for me. I cleaned it. This is one of the items which I had in my house that inspired me. And it's a sewn sampler made by Eliza Beevington at Ackworth School, the Quaker school in West Yorkshire. And I spent my entire life ignoring that. It turns out that she's one of my ancestors. I had no idea. And like I said, I wasn't very interested in sewing. It's religious. I'm not very religious. And it's about duty. I'm really not very dutiful. But I realized, desperation, you're at home, you've got to find something. So I saw that. And in all seriousness, I realized that what I really wanted to think about was not stories of anti-slavery that you find in the newspapers in the 19th century and so on, but girls and women who sewed, other things, people who meet on trains, people who bump into each other, chat, talk, writing and correspondence, not the big stories that we know about. And in a way, that's what this book's about. It's about the quotidian, the everyday, serendipity, how you bump into someone and it changes your life. So, and I realized I had to do that because I couldn't go anywhere. I did manage eventually to get to places, and these things were very important to me. And I'm hoping, if I've got time at the end, just to read you a little extract of going to the Lake District, which turned out to be important to me. But I also realized I had to have a set of key terms to hang this book on. So I'm just going to talk about the terms of the title of the book. So the book starts with, so let me just, I can just hold that up to you now. It's called Anti-Slavery in the Dissenting Atlantic. It's an academic book, so it's a long title. Sorry about that. Archives and Unquiet Libraries, 1776 to 1865. And you might see that it's a kind of dissident Atlantic. That's to say, it's turned the wrong way up. They did a wonderful job with this. And what they've also done is they've incorporated all the stitching from that sampler into the book beautifully. I didn't ask them to do that, but I was absolutely delighted when I saw this because I think it's a lovely object. So, let's judge a book by its cover, shall we? It's magnificent. So, anti-slavery, that's the first word. In my book, anti-slavery is an inclusive term. It covers a range of different positions encompassing egalitarianism and paternalism. So it's not all good, right? And at the same time, it obfuscates such distinctions. So it encompasses them and it hides them. Now, I don't in the book probe all the ways in which all the people I studied understood anti-slavery, nor how their beliefs changed over time. But throughout the book, we encounter figures whose beliefs coalesced to some degree, but were sometimes profoundly at odds with each other, especially when it came to ideas about political and especially racial identity. It became very clear to me that people who were agitating about anti-slavery were not necessarily people who wanted to live next door to people of colour, or with, indeed, but they were willing to work together for a common cause. Their contributions took many forms: letter writing, petitioning, public speaking, sewing, editing books, writing tracts, pedagogy, social justice teaching. And a number, but not all of them that I study, are religious dissenters whose theological beliefs and doctrinal practices emerging from the Protestant Reformation positioned them outside of the fold of the established church in Britain, but also in consequence outside of many social and educational institutes. Quakers couldn't go to university, for example. There weren't Quaker schools until schools like Ackworth started to be founded. This library was a place that a Quaker who was a merchant and a middle-class man could come, but so did many Tories. It wasn't always a comfortable place, so it was complicated. So even in the book, those who weren't Protestant dissenters were engaged with what I think of as dissent. So they're participants in what I want to think of as the dissenting Atlantic. So then to think about those words then, what's the relationship between the word dissent and the word dissident? Because that's the thing I'm kind of playing with in this. Now, both of these words were used initially in the 16th century. I'm a literary scholar, so I always go back to the Oxford English Dictionary. So they've both started to be used in the 16th century. And they're semantically related, but they have different etymological roots. So dissident, I'm really credit my colleague Tony Crowley with this. He's a language person and has done this work. And I heard him speaking about it once. I said, oh, that's it. That's what I want to use. So dissident derives from desidere, to sit or settle oneself apart, and by extension, to be out of alignment. This is a quote from the OED, hence to disagree, differ, or be at variance. While dissent derives from dissentere, to feel or think in a different way, hence to differ in opinion, to disagree. So the people I'm looking at both sat outside of, but also disagreed with many of those in wider society, but they were peaceful people and they were usually happy to remain in fellowship with each other. They often dissented from received opinion, but within the communities out of which they emerged, their views were very strongly heard and held. And they were willing to accept the social and political consequences accompanying principles that were often unpopular. And some of them had very strong commitments to religious freedom, but also to ideas of liberty that came from a long way back. And this was particularly the case when their ethical principles were at variance with the law. So some of them undertook acts of civil disobedience, such as tax resistance, and they accepted imprisonment as a consequence. They understood they'd go to prison, and that was fine. So I'll just give you a quick example of how I talk about this in the book by using a figure who came from a religion that was not a dissenting religion. He was a Moravian. Some of you might have visited or might know Full Neck Moravian settlement in Pudsey. But Moravians were not dissenters, as they repeatedly told people, we are members of a Protestant Episcopal Church. Nonetheless, lots of people thought they were dissenters. So again, that's one of the confusions I talk about. This is a figure, James Montgomery. Any of you who've been to Sheffield might have seen the statue of him there. He was the radical editor of the Sheffield Iris. He was the son of Moravian ministers, and he was a poet and a hymn writer. His wide social and political network encompassed members of the Society of Friends and fellow abolitionists and radicals. And in 1795, after he published an anti-war ballad in the Sheffield Iris, he was accused of and convicted of sedition. And he was imprisoned in York Castle and then sent there again the following year when he, unbowed, spoke out against the treatment of political prisoners. And when he was confined, he met a man called Henry Redhead York, who was an Antigua-born mixed-race man charged with treason after speaking at an anti-slavery rally in Sheffield. I find when I'm thinking about all of this, it's all horribly coming back to haunt us now and what's going on at the moment. And he also met several friends, Quakers, from Lothersdale, North Yorkshire, who had been in prison for refusing to pay their tithes. So you can see that, you send someone to jail and they can become further radicalized, as we know by meeting these people who are just like them there. But you can also see by the presence of York, Henry Redhead York, I should say, that there are these other figures who are kind of milling about, who we need to know more about. They're interesting figures. So some of the figures I talk about in my book then used the language of benevolence, but they were also really radical. And I find that really exciting. And girls and women in particular who were empowered within Quakerism and encouraged to take on preaching roles or to undertake public duties were amongst those who were benevolent but radical. So I've thought a lot about, can you be quiet and a radical? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And I think I'm really interested in silence and quietness and unquietness in this book. Social justice activities and international peace activism, along with what Julie Holcomb calls the moral commerce of free produce activism, were foundational to the lives of many Quakers and were closely connected to other reform movements and to abolition. So it follows logically then that highly aware of participating in groups with long-standing and principled commitment to challenging convention, the figures I discuss often open to becoming the allies of other marginal figures and were willing to take on unpopular causes. And these included most particularly free and enslaved blacks who were committed to abolition. After all, the most radical actors of all. Cross-racial, cross-class, cross-gender friendships and other forms of alliance then created a labile, shifting and extensive social network or fellowship across and within the Atlantic world. It transcended the operations of the nation state, and it reached out beyond ports, beyond cities, beyond towns and into the hinterlands. And again, in the book, I'm really interested in figures of colour living in Britain who are not living in cities, who are not in Bristol, who are not in Leeds, but they're living elsewhere. And there were many. Times this brought together people who knew of each other through talk. You meet someone by chance, you talk to them, or by print, including powerful local newspapers such as the Leeds Mercury, but also face-to-face encounters. So while anti-slavery was often organised and tactical, it also relied on happenstance and opportunism of what happens when people bump into each other. And it changed and developed over time, of course. And it was an integrated and radical social movement, foundationally underpinned by the actions of the enslaved themselves. So now another term in the book, archives. You could hear the way I became interested in looking at archives and looking at census items and really probing them. And you can hear me say that what became interesting to me is also what isn't in the archive and what's excluded. And I began to think about what I then called the unquiet library, what a library is and what it isn't. And the fact that I've always been really frustrated that you've got quiet in libraries because I'm a talker and I don't like that. When I was a university student, there are a couple of people here who were at university with me and to whom I used to talk in the library. There was a librarian who used to come along and say, "No conversazione, please." And as soon as she'd go, carry on talking. So I began to think about libraries in this way. Now, libraries, as we know, are foundational to the lives of many of us. And they were certainly critical to the lives of many of the people I talk about, not least because they gave them access to books that they simply wouldn't have had access to otherwise, especially blacks, but also many women. They were the spaces where the local encountered the global through the collections of books that allowed their members to imagine the possibilities of distinct kinds of geographies, systems, and worlds beyond their immediate environs. Libraries are physical locations too of sociability. Look at us all, where like-minded individuals met, providing sanctuaries for those who face persecution elsewhere and allowing for an array of different kinds of meetings, some of which are chance, some of which are organised. Elizabeth McHenry, whose work restores lost and neglected knowledge about the importance of the reading practices of free blacks in the North before the Civil War and Black Americans after the war, reminds us that Black literary societies, this is a quote, further the evolution of a Black public sphere and a politically conscious society. And we know that libraries far exceed what's contained on their shelves and the interactions that take place in them and the imagined worlds that they allow to happen are imaginatively and otherwise really important. So yes, they contain the possibility of really extraordinary liberatory power, but they're also the product of troubling histories. Sean Moore has revealed that while some colonists in the United States were arguing in early America for abolition, early American libraries, including the ones they were working in and building, were actually building their collections using money built from the slave trade. So they're very contradictory places. Meanwhile, Ellen Gruber-Garvey has demonstrated the importance of anti-slavery reading rooms to the Black community in New York and Rochester in the 1830s and 40s, hotbeds of abolition and resistance. So libraries need further investigation if we are going to better understand their role in addressing and redressing the democratic deficit experienced by dissenters such as those I talk about, but even more particularly, as I also discuss, by the enslaved individuals whose rights were abrogated by slavery and by the free blacks who fought against white supremacists. So I tried to think about libraries in this way and to think about an analytical tool that would allow me to do this. I wanted to think about the library as a place that wasn't quiet then, and it wasn't noisy, but it was unquiet. And I began to think maybe this idea of unquiet would allow me to do something. So that word then encompasses all of those things that I talk about, this sense of restlessness and activity and absence of quietness, the production and creation of disquiet, those things that make us uncomfortable. Those things that make us uncomfortable are very important. And although libraries are superficially then places of silence, or more specifically, are places in which a chosen or temporary silence is cultivated and becomes the condition in work can take place, what that silence produces is something that is unquiet in the way that I hope I'm describing. So written texts, they're not silent. They contain ideas and words, speech and discussions of all kinds. I mean, we know the idea of the talking book now very much, but even in the 19th century, they're not silent things. The print public sphere, it's a social sphere, and libraries are sociable locations. So that was something I've really been thinking about, and I've really been thinking about the relationship, again, and you can find this in libraries, between the local, Leeds, and the global. You come to Leeds Library, you read a book about something on the other side of the world, and you're transported. And the imagination allows you to do that. You see, I am really a literary scholar. I'm always interested in the imagination. So these unquiet libraries, together with the reading that goes on in them, can produce powerful and transformative actions, which includes, I hope, writing books. But I just want to reiterate that libraries also exclude, and they're increasingly threatened with closure, or they've been closed. And as we know, book banning is on the rise. And an article I read in the Washington Post just yesterday talked about the numbers of books about slavery that are now being taken out of public parks in the US in their bookshops because they are criticizing the kind of idea of an evolution of American exceptionalism, which the current administration doesn't like. And we know then, historically speaking, over a very long time, that the destruction of libraries and their contents is a key weapon for those who wish to assert control, dominate the sources upon which knowledge production relies, and silence dissent. And library scholarship reminds us that also curatorial and archival practices aren't neutral. And they have a key role in determining whose voices are preserved and whose aren't, who's in the archive and who isn't, creating what Alberto Manguel, the one-time director of the National Library of Argentina, has called, it's a powerful quote, a shadow library of absences. So think of all the things that are in here, and then think of all the things that aren't. Far more that's not in here than is, and think about why. And I'm very conscious of that these days, that now so much is available as a researcher online, but there's a paywall between a lot of us and what we can access, which if you're fortunate enough to work at a university, hopefully the university is paid for this, but if you're not, you can't get it. And I know that you, Nick, are really interested in open research and transforming this, but we need to be alert to what's going on now, because it is changing our access to things. These things are being privatized. So thinking now, I've described the kind of title of the book, the dates of the book: 1776, American Revolution; 1865, the passing of the 13th Amendment that finally makes slavery illegal. And I don't know, I felt I had to have a date, and I now wonder whether I needed a date, but I felt I needed a really long title and a date, so that's why that is in there. But more kind of joyously thinking then about how I'd organized the book, I realized that I wanted every chapter to open with an object, and then I just talk about that object, and it would develop stories, and I wanted to incorporate stories. So the sampler that I've handed round, that opens chapter 1, and it allows me to think about a set of girls and women sewing in schools on both sides of the Atlantic. It allows me to think about sewing teachers who move backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, taking patterns and methods with them, sometimes to black schoolgirls, sometimes to white schoolgirls, and to think about how these ideas travel. It's allowed me to look at the records of Ackworth School, which are really extraordinary, and to see that some of their scholars, as they were called, who were not in affluence, so these are poorer Quaker children who couldn't have access to private tutors. I came across one story of a man who had walked with his son, I think 150 miles to get to the school, and then turned and walked all the way back home. This is really, really extraordinary, the story of Ackworth. It's a very powerful story. And I began to read about what girls and women were doing there, how it was happening on both sides of the Atlantic, how curricula was shared, how people crisscrossing the Atlantic. And I realized what a very important place it is, and a very important location for anti-slavery too. The second chapter opens with a piece of free trade cotton, which was purchased in a grocer's store, the store of Henry Richardson, an important Quaker, in Newcastle in about 1855. And it's allowed me not to think about Henry, who I am interested in, but Anna Atkins, who, like Eliza Beevington, was from the Cotswold. Like the three of them, attended Ackworth School. And she's most famous for purchasing the manumission of Frederick Douglass, perhaps the most celebrated, rightly so, formerly enslaved man ever. But actually, that's just a little bit of what she did. And everything else that she did has been eclipsed by this. So I do indeed tell the story of all the other things she did, which were also very extraordinary. And then I use the census example to open chapter 3. And then chapter 4, I really wanted to go across the Atlantic, and I really also wanted to talk about Moravians. Now, initially in the pre-COVID version of this book, I was actually going to talk about Benjamin Latrobe, who's one of the most important architects of the United States, and is also a Moravian who was born in Fulneck. Who would have thought? And I was really interested in looking at the architectural training he had had and wondering how it influenced the architecture of the US. And I did all the reading for it. And then I just thought, actually, I stopped being interested in it because I read about his uncle, John Antes, and I became really interested in him. So that chapter starts with 3 of the earliest surviving stringed instruments to be made in colonial North America, which were made by John Antes before he departed Pennsylvania permanently in 1764 to travel first to Germany, where he trained as a Moravian missionary, had a very, very good, one of the best educations in Europe was had by Moravian missionaries at that point. And then he traveled to Egypt, where he lived for a number of years before settling in Fulneck, but finally dying in the Moravian settlement in Bristol in 1811. Now, when I was reading, I think what really captured my imagination, which was when I was reading Antes' work, it was during a period of really intensive lockdown. And he was writing about the plague in Europe. And he was in lockdown and he was describing it. And that's when I abandoned Benjamin and turned instead to writing about John. And I realized that actually many accounts of anti-slavery take Moravians at face value and have them as heroes in this story of anti-slavery, especially in Britain. Because Moravians were missionaries who would teach the enslaved to read and write, would be in fellowship with them, would keep them as spiritual equals, and benefited greatly from talking up that. And many Quakers, including Wilson Armistead, said, well, look what they did. But what he didn't say, because they didn't advertise this quite so much, was that they didn't free them from slavery. They didn't do that. So, and they didn't encourage them to rebel against their slaveholders. They didn't do that. And indeed, in some of the archives I've looked at, one of the most disturbing items was a list of the chattel or the goods that were held in the Danish West Indies, which is a Moravian settlement. And it just lists pretty much like that census entry I showed you, the list of people who were held by the church in slavery. So I really wanted to redress some of this, start to tell a different story. I think Moravians in Britain, this is a really significant untold story. And because we live in Leeds, we're familiar with Fulneck. But when I talk to people elsewhere about Moravians, they don't really know who they are, unless you're in Pennsylvania, when you really do know. The largest number of Moravians currently is in Tanzania, where 27,000. It's a big group. But there aren't so many in Britain now. However, the Brontes knew about them. I mean, Ellen Nussey, Charlotte Bronte's closest friend, was educated in Gomersall Moravians Ladies Academy. And while Anne Bronte was dangerously ill, she asked to be attended by a Moravian minister. So I just feel this is unspoken knowledge that's gone from us, and we need to, and actually, sorry, another example, William Blake, his mother's second husband, or I can't remember, sorry, it's in the book, but I can't quite remember, was a Moravian, as was his mother for a period. And actually, when I look at some of his images, it makes sense. It just really makes a lot of sense in a way that it hasn't previously to me. So I guess what I'm saying is that this is a kind of really complicated story. Someone like John Antes was living in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, as a young man, at the same time as a woman called Magdalena Bewley Brockton, who was born in Guinea, captured as a child, enslaved, spent years living in Bethlehem, treated as a spiritual equal, until finally her enslaver, who wasn't a member of the church, by the way, manumitted her. She remained there and died in 1820, and she married there Ofubenda Wuma of the Igbo origin, who had also been enslaved in West Africa as a child and was known as Andrew. And what's really interesting about this now to scholars is that Moravians would write at the point of death a spiritual autobiography or a Lebenslauf. Their archives are in German, they tend to be in German. And that gives us the only then extant autobiographical narrative of a female captive who survived the Middle Passage. That's the only one, I think, that exists at the moment. Because of the nature of what it is, it doesn't describe the Middle Passage, but it's an extraordinary document and just suggests how much more there is to find. Now, I know I've got to 45 minutes and I was supposed to shut up at 45 or 50, but if you give me just 5 more minutes, I would like just to read a little tiny bit from the book to describe, which gives you a sense of the fact that I'm not very good at sitting at my desk. So if I can leave my desk and do something that is research, I'll always do it. And this was something that I decided to do, my visit to the Lake District, in other words, that I mentioned at the beginning. Basically, in reading everything I could by Wilson Armistead, which was a lot, I came across a book that claimed that everyone said was by Wilson Armistead, that he'd written it. I just thought, you know what, he was a busy man. He couldn't possibly have written this, but everyone said he did. And I went to everywhere I could find, everything said he did, and I still didn't believe it. And then finally, through a lot of searching, I found that he didn't write it. Of course, he didn't write it. He edited it and used a pseudonym. And I looked at some of the work within this, which was very interesting. And there was one particular piece that really struck me, and it was about rock carvings in the Lake District. So this is an edited book that was published, I think, in the 1840s or early 1850s, and talks about seeing rock carvings in the Lake District. And obviously, all these years later, what do? I drive to the Lake District to try and find them. And I did. And that was the exciting bit. But also finding them really allowed me to think about those things that this book is about, which is about silence and noise, about things that happen because people just have to do them. And it also allowed me to be a literary scholar for a bit, because I could do a bit of kind of close reading of the rocks, which was very, very nice. So it also made me think of things that people do when they're not supposed to, you know, filling in a census form deliberately incorrectly, carving rocks, saying things you're not supposed to do, sewing a sampler, putting the wrong words in because you wish to change the message. So here's a little bit I wrote about the rocks, and I'm not telling you where they are, because if I told you, I'd have to kill you, because they're in a very quiet place, on a very, put it this way, a very famous lake beginning with W. That's all I'll say. So I'll just read you this passage. He was a stone carver by trade, and he suffered from a profound mental illness, as far as I can work out. And it was through his anguish that he did this. His beautiful carvings are not well known today, though some of them can still be found on a tranquil spot on the edge of the lake, one beginning with W, something I discovered when researching this book. Coming across them was both thrilling and poignant, and I stayed with them for a long time, the silence of their surroundings only punctuated by birdsong. Though the act of creating the carving would have been noisy, once he had contemplated his work, he may have sat, as I did, contemplating their meaning. In performing his solitary labour, he participated in an ancient tradition of leaving markings on the landscape. So did more famous figures such as Dorothy, John, and William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Mary and Sarah Hutchinson, who in 1802 inscribed their initials into a rock by the Turnpike Road between their respective homes in Grasmere and Keswick, a few miles north of Longmire's Rocks. Unlike them, however, his focus was on recording people, events, and concepts beyond himself in the public realm. On one large rock, he carved the names of poets, including Burns, Dryden, Gray, Milton, and Scott, and dramatists and public figures, including Edward Jenner, who had created the smallpox vaccine. In addition, he carved short and suggestive phrases, including the liberty of the press, Magna Carta, money is the sinew of war. And on another rock, this is my favorite, the single word, steam, in large letters. But particular attention in this piece I read is drawn onto two stones, both of which were related to anti-slavery. And this is a quote from this edited book that Wilson Armistead didn't write, but he did edit. On one large red stone of at least 10 feet square was engraved, quote, 1833, money, full stop, liberty, full stop, wealth, full stop, peace, full stop, a catalogue of blessings very much to be desired. On another, in larger characters, quote, a slave landing on the British strand becomes free. So you need to imagine this by Lake Windermere. Now, while the words liberty and peace are self-explanatory, it's less clear why money and wealth are part of this list. This is me speaking now. Perhaps Longmire was referring to the compensation paid to British planters in 1833, an injustice that continues to resonate today. But that sentence, a slave landing on the British strand becomes free, references the 1772 Somerset case, which was one of the early legal milestones in abolition. But here it seems to stand alone in a declarative manner, while also implying further narratives about freedom and possibility, such as those engendered by the Slavery Abolition Act. But imagine differently, so I'm a literary scholar, imagine differently, it's more literally illustrative. The word strand refers to the shore of a sea, a lake, or a river, and the rock on which the sentence is carved is itself on a strand, on the edge of a lake. So in the very act of reading, an individual might pause and allow themselves a particularly vivid sense of its implications. Situated within the natural world, carved into rock, using unadorned language not dissimilar to what Wordsworth famously described as the real language of men, Longmire's inscriptions responded to current events and human achievement and aimed for longevity. Indeed, the carvings echo Wordsworth's insistence in the preface to Lyrical Ballads on the importance of a language that communicates precisely because of the powerful connection between human emotion and the permanence of the natural world. This liminal site is both hallowed by poetry and consecrated by history, but it was also the product of human skill and the anguish of mental illness. These engravings were produced in stone in a period in which there was particular attention to rock formations. The word paleontology was first used in France in 1822 to describe the way the study of fossils allowed humans to develop an understanding of ancient organisms. So his work was created between that moment and the point of publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, of course, which drew attention to the long history of evolution and the use of fossils as evidence of the explosive theory that would challenge the faith of many Christians. A professional stonemason such as Longmire would doubtless have had personal experience of the way that rocks can contain and embody evidence about the historical past. Likely he had come across fossils, faults, mineral deposits, and so on in the stones on which he worked. Armistead certainly understood the connectivity of land masses, for as we have seen, he was an amateur meteorologist, by the way, he had personal evidence that an earthquake in North Africa could be felt in the United Kingdom. He records this in his records when he was very young. But it's possible that neither man knew that though the landscape of the Lake District might seem timeless, its mountains and lakes have themselves migrated across the Earth's surface over many years. They are, as the geographer Doreen Massey memorably wrote, immigrant rocks, just passing through here and changing all the while. His inscriptions speak to a history that we're continuing to explore and explain, one that needs reimagining as more evidence is unearthed. And as we add new context and explore unfamiliar sources, we demonstrate that history, like historiography, is never set in stone, but it's always subject to change and movement. This can sometimes be rapid, but at other times it's slow and inexorable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for sharing that fascinating journey, which is very, very moving and I think a new field of history, certainly for me and for others, I guess. Do we have any questions or observations that we would like to put to Bridget? Yeah, Danny.
Where is the book available?
Well, if you want 40% off on this flyer, I can give you this flyer and you can get 40% off. They gave me a very few copies and you can buy it on Kindle for £14, but he likes, I love reading detective novels on Kindle, but not books you want to turn the pages and mark them.
I just ordered one from Waterstones actually before I knew.
Oh, well, you haven't got 40% off. Maybe it's time for you to rush back there and cancel it or buy another one. If you could buy a second copy.
Okay, we've got another question here.
I'm particularly interested in a bloke called John Blades, who was one of the gentlemen merchants of Leeds, one of the richest. He died in 1804. In that period after 1776 that we've been covering, how much did you find out about the Leeds gentleman elite involvement in the slave trade? And could you plot which of them turned against it and joined the anti-slavery movement? And if so, how did you do that?
Okay, so in turn, I didn't. I can't, and it's work that needs to be done. Right. So I did the work that I could do. You know, I'm a literary historian, I'm a literary scholar, right? I did the work that I knew that I could do. But I wasn't, that's not my particular focus, but I really think this is important work to be done. I also realized through looking in newspapers that at the later point, there are a lot of Confederate supporters too during the Civil War. So this is not just a story about people supporting anti-slavery. It's a story about people supporting slavery. I mean, there are many people who were not progressive in this regard, but perhaps you should be doing that. I mean,
well, I've tried. My problem is I've tried, and I'm fairly certain that the whole of Leeds, the cloth making community, the people who bought the cloth from the people who made it outside the city and then sold it on, I'm fairly certain that the economy was based upon selling it to America and selling it to Africa. So they would have been implicitly involved in the slave economy.
For sure.
But what I'm trying to understand is, I know there was a ship called Blades, for instance, and I know that one of Blades' relatives was a slave trader and he owned ships. And I know that a guy who was related to him, two of his children married a Liverpool slave trader banker. But I can't really find the solid evidence either in the newsprint or in other archives.
So what I'd say, two things. I mean, that sample is made of linen, right? So they were carefully not using cotton, and the Quakers that I've been working on were careful to think about making sure they were using as much as they could free labor cotton, and were very involved in the sugar abstention of the late 18th century, and then other campaigns of the early 19th century. But what I'd also say is this question, I mean, because I'm not a trained historian, I have chosen to take a lot of liberties when you think about what you know for sure and what you don't know for sure. And I think it's one of the ways in which historiography is really changing, actually, because actually, if all you're talking about is what you can really find in the archive, you're never going to be able to tell a lot of stories because it's not there. And there's a great scholar called Saidiya Hartman who works on anti-slavery and on Black lives, who's talked about critical fabulation, about getting to the point where you pretty much know what a story is, but you don't have that final piece of evidence. And then you have to use the best skills you have to create a story and say, that's as close as I'm going to get. And I think you have to be, I do think you have to be free to be able to do that. My anxiety about this here, that's the cheap version of it, this expensive version of it. And the reason I didn't want this to be published in a history series was because I'd been to enough history conferences where people say, it's got to be empirical, you've got to have the evidence. And I've been to enough literary conferences where people say, but there isn't the evidence, we have to start imagining things. And it's that balance, isn't it, between how you use the imagination, about how you recreate lives on the basis of the evidence you have and you piece it together. And then you say, using a mathematical phrase, almost surely, almost certainly. And I think that has to be sufficient. So that would be my sense. There may be answers that you can't absolutely find, but you can find parallel examples and say, from this, it seems very probable that. But there are also plenty of merchants engaging in cloth in Leeds who weren't purchasing cotton, who were working with flax and other things. So there is a kind of counter narrative to that too.
I'm just thinking in relation to what you just said, that isn't it then hugely important that you make it crystal clear about where your imagination takes off? Yeah. Otherwise, you enter into what I feel is a kind of Trumpoid world where I can say what I like because that's what I think, that's what I imagine, and blow your facts. Yeah, because they're my facts, exactly.
Absolutely right. And but you'll see in me showing you the slave centers and all of those things that I'm kind of slightly anally obsessed about the research. That's the bit I really, really like. I really like finding the detail. That's the bit I absolutely love. But there comes a point at which there's something and you think, so with the example of the Wilson Armistead book, the book by Wilson Armistead, which I couldn't believe was by him. That was me just thinking, it's improbable, it's unlikely. Everyone says this was, I don't believe them. And, I was right. I was right.
Where was that evidence from?
The evidence that I was right. It's in the book, Nick, I have to find it. It was just one little extract from a catalogue in a library that said something like, I can't quite remember it now, but something like this was edited and sold to produce money for anti-slavery. But in the dictionaries of pseudonyms and everything I looked at, and in an argument I had at the point at which this was in proof, so it had proofs of this book, and I'm not an argument, having an online engagement with a man who's going, no, he wrote it. And I was going, he can't have done. And then I just thought, I haven't got time to check this. And I thought, no, I have to. And I just took 2 days off and just searched properly. Because I was thinking, actually, does anyone care? Because actually, it's an academic book. Who's really going to read this? There is a part of me that thinks that. But I thought, no, I care. I need to get this right. So... But you're right. Yeah, there's a point you can't just say anything. And you have to have the credibility of doing the groundwork, of doing the proper research, then to be able to step away and say, look, I don't know absolute evidence of this, but based on all of these things, it seems likely. If we assume that this happens, then what follows? But you have to have the credibility first. Of course you do.
And of course, I'll cite that on Wikipedia.
That would be very good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, this gentleman here.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's fantastic talk. Does Mary Armistead have a voice?
Yeah, I wish she did. He, not much, funnily enough. And when he died, he gave his membership of this library to his sons. So he also had female children. So that quite annoyed me, actually. And no, I haven't been able to find anything out really about her, except through knowing that she was the librarian for the association, knowing that she was collecting materials. The thing I haven't been able to find yet, and I really, really hope it exists because it would be amazing, is his personal archive. I haven't found that yet, and I have searched, but he is not the main subject of this book, but I would love to find that. And I'd love to find out more about her. I mean, even there's a book called Piloted by his son, who went on to work in fisheries in Norway. to write this book about fish. But in the opening chapter, he does talk about a few things, actually. One of them that's quite interesting is his family's financial situation. And then the other is that his father was really interested in anti-slavery, but he doesn't mention his mother. And so that's really frustrating to me, and just seems, again, kind of typical, right? So deliberately in this book, I start with a provocation, which I start in the Leeds Town Hall with an anti-slavery meeting of young men. And I start with this because it's a wonderful occasion, and it's a fine occasion. It's how we think of things. They're in newspapers, so we think this is the history. And then I move away and say, who wasn't there? And then it's women and children and all kinds of people. And I have women in Woodhouse Moor who are being kept from going out in the streets because of the dog nuisance in Woodhouse Ridge. It turns out all these out of control dogs are running around, so the women have to stay at home. So I begin to think, well, what were they thinking about then? So again, that is where imagination comes in. Perhaps they were thinking about, and you have to speculate, because how would I ever know what a woman, in 1859 was thinking unless she's written it down? Couldn't possibly, but she might have been thinking about these things. And if she was, then what? So no, it's great absence.
Okay. Alan, did you have a
question on Lucy Bailey, who's watching on Zoom, trying to help me know to read. I'm involved in a project with Dr. Burton Jones, because looking at the legacies of abolition songs, how such songs, whether sung by the enslaved on plantations or songs written and sung in Britain, promoted the abolition movement. In your studies, did you come across any evidence abolition songs being sung by the girls at Quaker School?
What a great question. I found out quite a lot about silence from the girls at the Quaker School, who weren't really, as far as I could tell, being encouraged to sing very much. No, I didn't, but I think that's an absolutely brilliant question. As you know, I'm speaking to camera because the speaker is there, I believe. As you know, there were a lot of performers such as the Jubilee Singers and others who were coming over and performing abolitionist songs. When the Crafts were performing as abolitionist lecturers, William Wells Brown was performing with them or speaking with them. As I said, Ellen Craft wasn't speaking, but he, together with William Craft, would sing slave songs publicly, and this went down very well. Henry Box Brown was doing this too. A number of figures were. Other abolitionists, especially Black abolitionists, didn't want to do this. They didn't want to sing those stories. They didn't want that kind of minstrel act to be part of their performance. And I'm sure you know this, but W.E.B. Du Bois, in his brilliant book, The Souls of Black Folk, which I think is 1905, he talks about these songs as the sorrow songs. He says people think that the enslaved sing when they're happy, but actually these songs are about profound sorrow. They're not about joy. They're not these things at all. So that might be a good source for you, but I doubt it. I'd really, really doubt it. But they were singing hymns, which were, actually, I'm not going to start speaking because I'll probably say something that I'm not quite sure about, and I'd rather know about it than say that. So I'll stop there.
Okay.